The Russian Federation is at war with Ukraine, and some of its supporters insist it will win because Russia doesn't lose war. They point to its vast territory, its cold climate, its manpower reserves, or its people's ability to endure hardship and accept death. And they point to great Russian victories of the past. So let's put this claim to the test and see what history has to say about Russia's record on the battlefield. Since the full-scale Russian-Ukrainian war began in 2022, you've probably heard a lot about Russia's military capabilities, not only in the present, but in history as well. Some politicians and pundits say that Russia will win in Ukraine because historically, Russia supposedly doesn't lose wars. To test these claims, for the sake of our investigation, we'll have to accept the common Russian assumption that today's Russian Federation is a continuation of historical states centered on what is today Western Russia, the Soviet Union, the Russian Empire, the Tsardom of Russia, and the Principality of Muscovy. Many Russians also argue that the Russian Federation is descended from the medieval Viking-ruled Eastern Slavic state of Kievan Rus, a claim, of course, that Ukrainians and Belarusians also make. Now, these states did win many major wars. Some of the most famous victories include the 13th century defeat of the Teutonic Knights, the Great Northern War against Sweden in the early 18th century, multiple wars against the Ottomans, crushing Napoleon's invasion in 1812, and the triumph of the USSR over Nazi Germany in World War II, though of course there were many other victories as well. Some of these successes came as part of coalitions alongside allies, but a win is a win. But just because a power has won some or even many wars doesn't mean it cannot lose any. So let's look at a few examples where the narrative of a historically invincible Russia might not hold. We'll start from the Russian point of view at the beginning. In Kievan Rus, in 1237, a Mongol army under Batu Khan invaded the Rus's principality. The various princes of Kievan Rus's state had first fought the Mongols years earlier, but they could not unite to face this new threat. Even if they had, the Mongol army was larger, more skilled, better led, and more innovative. The Mongols first captured and burned towns in northeastern Rus in today's Russia. Then they laid waste to the southwestern principalities in today's Ukraine, including Kiev. The Mongol victory was nearly total, which was clear to chroniclers at the time. For who will not weep at such destruction? Or who will not weep for so many Orthodox people perished? Or who will not regret so many murdered princes? Or who will not groan over such a conquest? Kievan Rus has ceased to exist as a political entity. Some principalities, including Muscovy, became tribute-paying vassals of the Mongol Empire for more than 2 centuries. About 300 years after the fall of Kievan Rus, the now independent Principality of Muscovy grew stronger and became the Tsardom of Russia in the 16th century. One of the Tsardom's goals in the mid-1500s was to gain access to the Baltic Sea. Tsar Ivan the Terrible decided to attack the weak Livonian confederation that ruled the Baltic coast, seeing it as an easy prize. Starting in 1558, his armies occupied most of the region. But the Kingdom of Poland, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, and the Kingdom of Sweden intervened, since they also wanted to control the Baltic coast. Poland and Lithuania soon merged into one commonwealth and pushed the Tsardom back across the pre-war border. They even besieged the Tsardom city of Pskovo. Meanwhile, Tsar Ivan was facing economic problems because of the heavy war taxes that he'd introduced, and Tatars from Crimea raided as far north as Moscow. In 1583, Ivan gave up his conquests in Livonia and some of his pre-war territory as well. The Tsar had no choice but to accept defeat, as a chronicler from Pskov pointed out. Tsar Ivan briefly seized a foreign land, but in the end He could not hold his own land either and had twice as many people killed. The defeat and the political and economic chaos that it caused helped plunge Russia into a period of civil war called the Time of Troubles in 1598. This civil war lasted until 1613. During this time, the Kingdom of Sweden and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth both got involved, sometimes to support one side or the other in the Russian Civil War, sometimes to take territory, or in the case of one Polish-Lithuanian prince, to unsuccessfully claim the Russian throne. Polish-Lithuanian forces captured important cities like Suzdal, Kostroma, and Smolensk, and even captured Moscow. Sweden conquered Novgorod and the northwest. At this time, Russia was essentially a failed state and could not defend its borders. A Russian prince described his country's defeat. Peoples rose against us and attacked us from different sides, ruining our land with force and savagery, and no one figured out how to fight the enemies. For a long time, our miseries continued. Poles and Lithuanians and Germans and Hungarians who were living around us harassed us. In 1612, a militia organized by a butcher and led by another Russian prince retook Moscow, but the series of Swedish and Polish-Lithuanian victories meant that Russia lost significant territory for over a century. In the early 19th century, the Russian Empire fought in several of the many conflicts that we call the Napoleonic Wars. The Russian Empire's most famous campaign of the period is no doubt its victory over the invading French-led army. But a few years earlier, in the Third and Coalition Wars from 1805 to 1807, things went very differently for St. Petersburg. In 1805, Napoleon completely crushed the combined Russian and Austrian armies at Austerlitz. Tsar Alexander, who was present at the disaster, reportedly said of Napoleon, "We are all babies in the hands of a giant." The French emperor allowed the defeated Russian army to retreat with its weapons. When another war broke out soon afterwards, Napoleon again defeated Russian imperial forces at Friedland in 1807, and Russia asked for peace. Cavalry officer Denis Davidov reacted to the news. The endless retreats, even when we were successful, the constant occupation of positions considered impregnable, and their subsequent abandonment at the first appearance of the enemy, and the absence of offensive action, all this drove me to despair. I was well aware of the glaring inequality of talent between Russian General Bennigsen and Napoleon, the disparity in numbers between our army and the enemy forces, the conviction among the larger part of our army that Napoleon was invincible, the material chaos that plagued us after the defeat at Friedland, the lack of supplies and reserves, and the enormous distance between ourselves and the militias that were still in the formative stage. Russia and France then signed the Treaty of Tilsit, which forced Russia to accept French control of its foreign trade and to become an ally of France, at least until 1812. In 1853, the Russian Empire attacked the Ottoman Empire, hoping to expand its territory and influence at the expense of the so-called sick man of Europe. France, Britain, and the Kingdom of Sardinia joined the Ottoman side to prevent its collapse, which changed the course of the war. Russian forces retreated from the Balkans, failed to break through in Anatolia, and the coalition landed an expeditionary force on the Crimean Peninsula, which Russia had conquered from the Ottomans some 70 years earlier. The Russian state and army proved incapable of gathering enough forces or to find a commander with enough skill to expel the Allied force in Crimea. Public discontent with poor governance and quality of life also played a role, according to contemporary Russian journalist Alexei Kashaliov. The Allied landing in Crimea in 1854, the subsequent battles in Alma and Inkerman, and the siege of Sevastopol did not upset us too much, as we were convinced that even the defeat of Russia would be better for her and more beneficial than the state. of affairs at the time. The public mood, even among the common people, however unreflective, was of the same kind. 50 years later, in the early 20th century, the rising Japanese Empire competed with the Russian Empire for influence in Manchuria and Korea. Russian imperial troops were stationed across the region, and they had a fleet based at Port Arthur. In 1904, Japan started the Russo-Japanese War with a surprise attack on that base and won a series of dramatic victories at sea and on land. The Japanese army defeated the Russians at the battles of the Yellow River and Mukden and wiped out the Russian Baltic Fleet after its round-the-world trip at the Battle of Tsushima in one of the most one-sided naval victories in history. Colonel Anton Denikin recalled the chaos at Mukden. Individual soldiers, sometimes in small groups, then scattering again, helplessly looked for a way out of the trap. The whole field, as far as the eye could see, was littered with abandoned boxes and heaps of luggage, even from the commander-in-chief's baggage train. Wagons and carts, ambulances, and riderless horses all rushed about in different directions. For the first time in the war, I saw panic. Defeat on the edge of the empire led to instability in the heartland, and the 1905 revolution broke out against the Tsarist autocracy. Faced with war abroad and revolution at home, St. Petersburg sued for peace. Politician Sergei Witt saw a silver lining. If there had not been the most insane and miserable war, the government could have continued to fight the current of public desire, and even then mainly by police measures. But the war exposed the heart of the government. Such sacrifices and horrors do not go in vain. The terms of the 1905 Treaty of Portsmouth reflected Russia's defeat. Japan took over the railway lines in Manchuria from Russia. Russia withdrew its military from Manchuria and the Liaodong Peninsula, and Russia accepted Japanese dominance over Korea. Japan also gained South Sakhalin Island. Less than a decade after the end of the war against Japan, the Russian Empire again faced the combination of battlefield struggles and revolution at home, which led to a much greater defeat. Russia entered the First World War in 1914 to maintain its prestige as a great power, protect its interests in the Balkans against Austria-Hungary, and to help Serbia. The army had several successes against Austria-Hungary in 1914 and 1916, but suffered serious defeats against the Central Powers at Tannenberg in 1914, in the Great Retreat of 1915, and at Lake Narok in 1916. Russia's economy and society crumbled under the pressure of the war effort, and revolution overthrew the Tsar in February 1917. The provisional government tried to continue the war, but the Central Powers stopped its summer offensive, and the army began to disintegrate. In November, a Bolshevik coup, or revolution, depending on your point of view, overthrew the provisional government and brought Vladimir Lenin to power. His priority was to stop the war at any cost to preserve the revolution. So in March 1918, Bolshevik Russia signed the Peace of Brest-Litovsk. The terms reflected Imperial Russia's crushing defeat. The Bolsheviks gave up their claim to former Tsarist lands in Finland, the Baltics, Russian Poland, and Ukraine. Menshevik politician Fyodor Dan was critical. The Peace of Brest did not free revolutionary Russia from the deadly noose of the war, which was strangling her. It only transformed her from an active participant in the war, capable, to the best of her ability, of defending her independent interests and aims, into a weak and powerless victim of the imperialist dump, into a prey to be torn to pieces by the warring countries. Following the Bolshevik takeover, Russia was embroiled in a civil war, mainly between the Bolsheviks and a counter-revolutionary White Russian movement, which wanted to restore the old Russian Empire without the Tsar. The Bolsheviks won, And even though the whites fought for the old imperial order, it's the Bolsheviks who are considered the continuation of the historical Russian state. In 1919, though, the Bolsheviks were still fighting the Civil War when they went to war with their new neighbor, the Second Polish Republic. The 1918 Brest-Litovsk Treaty was dead after the Central Powers' defeat, so the Polish-Russian border was an open question. Fighting raged back and forth across much of what is today Belarus and Ukraine. The Poles and their Ukrainian allies took Kiev, but the Russians pushed them back to the gates of Warsaw. There, the Poles won a dramatic victory against the Red Army and pushed the front line back east until both sides signed the Peace of Riga in 1921. Lenin later reflected on what might have been. If Poland had become Soviet, the Versailles Treaty would have been shattered, and the entire international system built up by the victors would have been destroyed. Instead, free Poland survived, and the new border was far east of what Moscow wanted, as the Bolsheviks gave up their claims on territories in today's Ukraine, Belarus, and Lithuania. The revolution never reached the rest of Europe, though the extent of Bolshevik Revolutionary War aims is still debated. Less than 20 years later, in 1939, Joseph Stalin decided to go to war against another neighbor, Finland. He wanted to reclaim this former part of the Russian Empire for what he saw as security reasons and install a communist puppet government. The Winter War lasted from November 1939 until March 1940, and while it wasn't a total defeat for the Soviet Union, Moscow did not achieve all of its goals. Finland remained independent and democratic, although the USSR did gain territory. The war was certainly a defeat from the prestige point of view, though. Many observers noted the relatively poor performance of the Red Army against a much weaker opponent, though it did learn some lessons for the coming war with Germany. Years later, even Stalin praised Finnish resistance. "You live the devil knows where. You live in bogs and forests. But in spite of this, you have built a state. You have fought for your state doggedly." Fame come chair. Compare. Belgians are held as one of the foremost cultured nations in Europe, but when war broke out, they surrendered. So I think that if the Finns had been put in the Belgians' place, I feel that they would have combated tenaciously against the German assailants. The Soviet Union's last foreign war also ended in defeat. Despite a Russian general's recent claim, the USSR did not lose this war at all. In 1979, Moscow sent its forces into Afghanistan, since a rebellion was threatening the communist government in Kabul. The Soviets installed a new socialist government, and for 10 years, Red Army troops battled the Mujahideen rebels, who received weapons from the United States. As the years went by, the Mujahideen scored more successes against the Red Army and the weak Afghan government, though the insurgents and the civilian population suffered heavy losses as well. Many Soviet troops, including airborne Colonel Yuri Lapshin, knew the war was lost. There's a complete inability of the troops and the government to fight, even under conditions where they significantly outnumber and outgun the enemy. Infighting nullifies the already weak efforts to stabilize the situation. In the north of Afghanistan, there are active military operations by the enemy. In other regions, joint opposition ruling bodies are formed and propaganda intensified. Again, considering all the information, the conclusion is there is nothing else to expect. In my opinion, the wisest course of action would be to withdraw. The Soviets finally did leave in 1989. The socialist Afghan government collapsed, and after a few years, the Taliban took over. Defeat in Afghanistan also helped destabilize the Soviet Union, just as it was weakening from other internal issues, leading to its collapse in 1992. Some might consider this disastrous end to the Cold War or Russian defeat, but we'll stick to hot wars for today. The current Russian Federation went to war on its own territory in 1994. The First Chechen War began when Russian forces entered Chechnya, legally a part of Russia, to overthrow the government of the Chechen Icarian Republic, which had declared independence. Chechen fighters inflicted heavy losses on the Russian army, and although the Russians killed the Chechen president and took the capital, Grozny Chechen forces recaptured the city in a major victory. Frequent Chechen ambushes and mass hostage-takings and poor Russian performance on the battlefield led to an armistice in 1996 and a peace deal in 1997. Russian troops withdrew, and Russia had failed to establish control over its own territory. The Russian Federation had lost its first war, though it would win the Second Chechen War a few years later. These examples, which we cherry-picked from a longer list of potential defeats, give us a clear answer to our question. Like any other country, big or small, Russia was not and is not invincible in war. Kievan Rus, Muscovy, the Ottoman Empire, and the Soviet Union won many wars against many enemies. But they lost many wars as well. Whether the current Russian Federation will win its war against Ukraine remains to be seen. But if history is a guide, victory is not inevitable. My work for real-time history requires frequent traveling, from my home base in Vienna to the studio in Berlin, to museums, historic sites, and more. Of course, I always want to be connected on the road or at my destination, but what I don't want is to have to pay through the nose for my data plan, or even get scammed trying to get a local SIM card. That's why Sally is such an invaluable travel companion. Sally is a global eSIM service for travelers who want to stay connected on their trips. It offers hundreds of flexible travel data plans in over 180 countries. Before your trip, just download the Sally app on your eSIM-compatible smartphone. And once you arrive, pick an affordable data plan that's right for you, and say goodbye to roaming fees. If your trips take you through several countries, like my route to our studio, you can also pick a plan that covers multiple countries and save even more. And with Sally, you don't need to swap your SIM in every different country. Speaking of savings, get an exclusive 15% discount on Sally data plans. Download the Sally app and use the code RealTimeHistory at checkout, or go to Sally.com/realtimehistory. Get your travel data sorted with Sally and enjoy smooth, safe, and reliable internet access while you're away. We want to thank Sofia Shirgorova for her help with this episode. If you're interested in some of the Russian campaigns we mentioned here on Real-Time History and on our sister channel, The Great War, we've covered many of them in detail. For example, in our 3-hour documentary on Napoleon's invasion of Russia in 1812, or our video about the Polish-Soviet War. More links are in the video description below. I'm Jesse Alexander, and this is a production of Real-Time History, the only history channel that wants to see an alternate history timeline where Finland and Belgium switch places.